So welcome again. Today we have Colorado Mesa University. It's located in Grand Junction, Colorado, USA. It offers undergraduate and graduate program. We have with us Mr. Elect Knight. Colorado Mesa University is located in Grand Junction, Colorado, USA. It offers undergraduate and graduate program. We have with us Mr. Elect Knight. Elect, you here?
Yes, I'm here.
Hi, Elect. Alec is the coordinator of international student admission and program at Colorado Mesa University. He has over 6 years of experience working in international education, including 4 years at CMU. He is going to take a very important question that is related to each one of us. What type of challenges do international students face while studying abroad? Alec, the stage is all yours. Please take it over.
So our topic today, we're going to discuss some of the challenges that international students experience while studying in other countries. So this is obviously coming from the perspective of studying in the US, but if students were to choose to study in the UK, Australia, Canada, you'd find very similar challenges and experiences across the board, or pretty much any other country that's not your home country that you might choose to study in. So really, there are two broad categories of challenges that international students will experience. One of them is just the set of challenges that pretty much every new student at the university level experiences, whether they're from the next town over or the other side of the planet. Then there is also a set of challenges that are more specific to people who are studying as international students. We're going to focus primarily on those challenges for international students, but I did want to touch on the challenges that kind of everyone experiences. So college is a time of transition, really. You're moving on from kind of that high school teenager experience to adult life. You have the freedom to choose how to spend your time and what you do, and there's a lot less oversight for what you do. But with that increased freedom comes increased responsibility. And you are ultimately the one who's accountable for how you choose to spend your time. So at pretty much every university across the board, there's a huge number of resources that are available. But ultimately, it's your responsibility to reach out for those resources and access them. Unlike high school, where there's possibly a guidance counselor or another professional staff person whose job it is to make sure you get the help you need, in a university setting, usually it's your responsibility to ask for the help you need. One of the things that you'll need to get used to is the concept of self-advocacy. Again, there's millions of dollars and many full-time staff who are just waiting in the wings to help a student who needs it. But if you don't ask for it, you don't get that help. Another challenge that is very common for everyone when you move away to college is just being homesick. Unless you're in a university in your hometown, chances are you're away from home, possibly for the first time in your life. Your friends and family from high school aren't necessarily right there with you. Your family isn't right there. And even potentially pets are another thing that you will miss and that will make this a more challenging experience. And then lastly, like as I've mentioned before, again, you are ultimately responsible for choosing how you spend your time. Depending on where you go, the choices of activities that you can choose from outside of the classroom are going to be different. But pretty much everywhere, there's going to be no shortage of things that you could spend time doing as opposed to studying or going to class. Whether that's sporting events, whether that's student organizations, whether that's getting involved with the larger community outside of your university. There's really no shortage of things to do with your time, but you always have to remember that your time is ultimately finite. So that is one of the things that you will need to get used to. So now we're going to switch gears a little bit and focus on some of the challenges that are more specific to the international community. So as an international student in the US, you are here on either an F1 or a J1 visa. And as such, you are under a very specific set of rules governed by the type of visa you have. These rules are often different than what a domestic student would be operating under. So This is something that you need to be aware of the entire time you're here. Ultimately, the purpose of this visa is for you to study and complete your degree, and anything that isn't putting you closer to that degree or is actually detracting from that goal is usually outside of the rules of that visa. Some examples of those rules. So there's a full-time study requirement. So at Colorado Mesa University, all students who want to be considered full-time have to be enrolled in at least 12 credits. For international students, that looks a little bit different because the number of online classes that are available to you is limited compared to a domestic student who could be full-time status and in all online classes, whereas an international student in the US must take at least 9 credits in person. So that's an example of, again, how the rules are different between international students and domestic students. Also, the way you're allowed to work is different for a US citizen or a permanent resident versus an international student. So an international student on their visa is allowed to work, but that work can only happen on campus. So you can't just go find a job anywhere. That would be working outside of the authorization granted by your visa, which would result in visa termination. You're also limited in the number of hours you can work per week. While classes are in session, you're allowed to work up to 20 hours. And then while during break periods, you're allowed to work up to 40 hours. Domestic students don't necessarily have those same restrictions placed on them. Plus, they're allowed to work wherever they want. Also, international students have a certain set of documents that pertain to their visa status. As you can see at the bottom of the screen, that's a picture of an F1 student visa, which is a foil that goes in your passport. There are other documents that go along with this, but again, a domestic student doesn't have specific documents that show their legal ability to remain in the United States. Another challenge specific to immigration that international students experience is that to be eligible for either of these visa types, you have to show that you are able to fund your own education, because none of these visa types are eligible for any kind of federal student aid from the US government. And sometimes that presents a challenge, especially, if you're coming from a country where the home currency isn't necessarily strong against the dollar, that can lead to some challenges in being able to pay for your education. So what this really all boils down to is that you, the student, are responsible for operating within the rules of your visa. So my office, that's what part of what we do, is advising students on those rules. But if a student on an F1 visa makes a decision that affects their student status, they're the ones who are going to experience the consequences of that. And representatives of the university are legally bound to enforce the consequences of a choice that potentially violates the terms of their visa. There's also just differences between educational systems around the planet. Every country pretty much has its own standards, its own approaches to education, and what things look like can sometimes be a bit of just a transitional experience. So some countries, what education looks like is simply different. Are you just memorizing information to be able to then repeat it during an examination? Or are you trying to take a concept and analyze it, break it down, be able to apply it in multiple different situations? In the US, there's kind of a mix of these two different approaches, but the trend is much more towards the discussion and analysis side of things. So that is a potential place where students might sometimes struggle. If you're coming from a country where a student in a university setting doesn't talk to the professor is just there to present and give information to these students, you're probably going to have a hard time the first time you sit down in a discussion-based class, about, say, Western literature or a philosophy class that is very discussion-heavy. So that's part of the transition that might be challenging. Also, grading systems differ a lot between countries. Part of my job is credential evaluation. So I take various grading scales from all over the planet and convert them to the US grading scale when I make determinations for admissibility or scholarship eligibility. So I've seen a lot of different scales. Some countries use a percentage, some countries use letter grade, some countries use a numbering system. It can vary widely, so you will have to get used to, say, the letter grading system that we use here in the US. So you'll have to adjust kind of your understanding and, okay, so I'm getting a B in this class. What does that mean? And does it mean I'm doing well? Does it mean I need to work on things? These are all things that you'll need to adjust to as well. Also, pretty much with any area that you might be operating in life, each place and area will have its own kind of vernacular or terminology. So the terms that you'll see on a class schedule, or, you know, if we talk about things like the add drop deadline or withdrawing from a class versus taking an incomplete on a class, these all have different, very specific meanings that you will need to start learning and being able to figure out. And again, my office would be a great resource on helping you figure out some of these things as a new student. Also, one thing that you might want to be aware of is a lot of US universities are big on acronyms. Instead of saying the full name of a building or of a department or something along those lines, we often use acronyms just to shorten things. So my office is International Student Admissions and Programs, but oftentimes on business cards, you'll see just ISAP. So that's another thing to get used to. And then coming back to that point of educational systems being different, how you interact with faculty is probably something you'll also have to adjust to. Here in the US, it's normal for professors to hold office hours several times a week, where if you're having trouble with a specific concept in the class, you're expected to go in and talk to the professor about those issues and try to figure out ways that you can bridge that gap. Also then, what is expected in class? Again, we've talked about, you know, if you're expected to participate, you know, sitting in the back and not talking is a surefire way to affect your grade. So be sure to read through any syllabus you might receive that will clarify what the grading and the expectations are in a given class. Also, one other thing that we've had some students potentially struggle with in the class, conceptions of time are deeply rooted in what culture you're coming from. So if you're coming from a place where, you know, things are approximate and a meeting that starts at 10 a.m. might really get going sometime around 10:20, that's a potential stumbling point because in the US, punctuality is considered very important. So if class begins at 10 a.m., it starts at 10 a.m. and 1 second, the professor is going to begin talking. And some professors are taking attendance. So this might be something you need to adjust as you're starting to figure out kind of how things fit together in your new educational context. So we're going to expound a little bit on just some financial challenges that are potentially experienced by international students. The first thing is that international students pay out-of-state tuition. So in the US, residents of a specific state can sometimes get a special tuition rate. So if I were to go back to school here as a resident of Colorado, I can get in-state tuition at our in-state university. International students unfortunately don't have that privilege because the terms of their visa status do not allow them to ever establish residency. By that same token, because these visas have self-funding requirements, you're not eligible for what is called the FAFSA, or the Federal Application for Student Aid. So you can't get any money from the US government to help fund your education either. Essentially, no need-based funding of any kind is allowed. We've already touched on kind of the limits on working, and then there are also scholarships to discuss. So not every university in the US has scholarships for international students. CMU is an exception to this. Every single international student who applies is automatically considered for a scholarship, but that isn't always the case. Again, some universities, you're just expected to pay full out-of-state tuition, and that's the end of the story. Also, another thing to keep in mind is that tuition is generally something that it increases a little bit, single-digit percentages every year. So the tuition you pay as a first year isn't necessarily the tuition you'd pay as a senior. So that's just something you need to plan for. Also, paying in foreign currency can sometimes be a challenge, especially if your currency is not strong relative to the dollar. So the cost could be relatively higher if the discrepancy between the dollar and your home currency continues to get larger. There are also challenges that you might experience while paying for things, just because In some countries, it's a very cash-based economy. You're expected to carry around bills and coins, and that's how you pay for things. And credit cards aren't necessarily as much of a thing, or they are not necessarily accessible to the general population. In the US, while cash is still considered king, as it were, we're increasingly moving towards a card-based economy. They're easier to carry. If a credit card gets stolen, you can cancel it immediately and you're not liable for fraudulent charges. So there's various reasons why we're, as a country, moving towards that. The last thing is a social security number. So an F1 student can get a social security number as it's required for employment, but employment is the only reason that a student can apply for one. Every year we get students who want to get a social security number so they can, apply for a credit card, or they can do a background check to apply for housing. Unfortunately, none of those are reasons why an F1 student can apply for a social security number. That's something we would help you with, but employment is the sole reason why you'd be allowed to apply for that. Another thing to think about are potential language difficulties. Depending on where you're coming from and what language you speak at home, it might not be English. English is the sole language of instruction for universities in the US, with very few exceptions. And that's another thing to get used to, is you might have been taught British English, for instance, with slightly different spellings, slightly different terminology for kind of everyday items. So using that terminology might get you some weird looks in class, just because, again, American English is slightly different from British English. In a US university setting, expect a lot of reading and writing. It's not uncommon for professors to have you read multiple entire books throughout the course of a class in a semester. So yeah, that's something that you need to be prepared for. And then you're often going to be writing about what you have read, or there's going to be other writing assignments that are assigned throughout the semester. Discussion heavy classes are also very, very common. And participation is a mandatory part of your grade, so something to be prepared for. And also, this again largely depends on where you're coming from and how many other students are from that same place, but there might not be many other speakers of your native language on campus. This will also vary a lot depending on the size of the campus. At a large flagship state school like CU Denver or CU Boulder, there's much more likely to be a handful of students from any given country, as opposed to a smaller campus like CMU is right in the middle. And we have a fair number of countries represented, but we don't necessarily have a large number from any one country or language group. So just some potential language difficulties that you would want to be prepared for. And then one of the last things we're going to talk about is culture and culture shock. So culture shock is a psychological term that's broadly defined as the feeling of disorientation that you experience when you're suddenly finding yourself in a new cultural context. You're spending time for a long, protracted time outside of the culture that you grew up in. And things are unfamiliar, whether about how people live, or sets of attitudes surrounding everyday life or social interaction. This is thankfully not a permanent experience, but it is often one that students experience towards the beginning of a degree program. So we often talk about culture shock in terms of a roller coaster. So the picture on the left is kind of a good example of the emotional highs and lows that you might experience while you're kind of transitioning to a new university experience. Another thing to keep in mind is that in some countries, cultural norms aren't just social expectations, they're actually codified in law. So that's something to keep in mind, is what might be totally normal and acceptable in one country might be illegal and punishable in another country. And one of the last things we want to talk about is individualism versus community-focused cultural backgrounds. So the US prides itself on being a very individualistic culture. Each individual is responsible for their own destiny, is kind of how we like to approach things. And that might differ greatly from the cultural context that you're coming from. Some cultures stress community above all else, and belonging to a part of and being part of a group So that might be some friction you'll experience. In the US, part of that individualism comes back to the self-advocacy piece that we talked about several slides ago, where as an individual, it is your responsibility to make sure that you're getting the resources that you need. When where you're coming from, it might be the community's responsibility to help you as a member of. So these are all just things to keep in mind as you're kind of going through this transitional experience. Also, holidays and celebrations are going to be drastically different between countries, depending on, religious observances or kind of demographics. Things that are huge holidays in your home country are not necessarily going to be a celebrated holiday in whichever country you end up studying in. So that's just something that, again, you'll start to notice as you spend more time. And then lastly, what does, friendship and social interaction look like? How do you make friends? Where do you go to make friends? These are all things that vary, not just country to country, but part of a country to part of the country. The US is a gigantic country. So sometimes making friends in California doesn't end up looking the same as making friends in Indiana or New York. So this is a kind of an individual process that everyone has to navigate when they find themselves in a new setting. I myself had to do this because I studied abroad in Germany back in 2012. So that was an example of experiencing kind of all of these things. And I think the last thing we're going to talk about with this is that life back home goes on even when you're not there. And there are changes that take place in your home country that can make studying in the US even harder. So we've talked a little bit about currency fluctuations and how the ability to pay for your education might change over time. But by the same token, political instability. So if you're coming from a country with strained diplomatic relationships to the country you're studying in, that can create some issues that you'll have to navigate. Or natural disasters that might affect your family back home or affect, other people that you care about. These are challenges that sometimes you have no control over, and you might feel like there's more that you should be doing, even though you're on the other side of the world and you're supposed to be focusing on it. And family emergencies also happen, and as we've talked about before, this includes pets. I know when I was studying in undergrad, one of my pets back home died, and it was a challenging experience to not be able to be there for that. But again, life goes on, and this is all part of the process. So what are some examples of the support that you might receive for these specific challenges as an international student? So these examples are going to be specific to CMU, but you'll find kind of parallel offices regardless of where you. So here at CMU, for an international student, our international office is almost always the best place to start if you're looking for resources or you're struggling with a specific aspect of this transition. Examples of support offices, if you need some extra tutoring in a specific class because the content is difficult, the Tutorial Learning Center is a great place to start. The Student Wellness Center covers everything to do with health, whether that's, getting sick and needing medication, whether that is, needing mental health counseling. They treat the entire student, not just, one specific thing. Also, one program that my office offers that helps with some of these transition experiences, we have what's called the Peer Mentor Program, where a new international student is assigned a person who's been here for a while to help them navigate all of these new things. We also have a huge variety of programs and events. My office puts on several events each week just to make sure that international students have a way to engage with the larger community. These events, which also include just general campus-wide events, are great places to meet people. You get to learn about your new cultural context. You get to share your own culture with other people. It's just a great way to become involved in the campus community. And then lastly, there are student organizations that are specifically aimed at helping students navigate this. So we have an umbrella organization here called the Cultural Inclusion Council, which is made up of several different student affinity group alliances. And of those, one of them is the International Student Alliance, which is a student organization made up of both international students and domestic students who are interested in working with international students to, again, form these bonds, build relationships across cultures, and get to learn about people from all over the world. So these are great examples of the support structures that are in place. All right, and so that is just a broad overview of some of the challenges that an international student faces when they choose to study abroad. But if you have any quick questions, we might have to move those to the end of this presentation, but thanks for paying attention to this piece.
Thanks, Alec, for that wonderful presentation, basically clearing a lot of things that the international student face challenges while studying abroad. Thank you very much.